In 2024, a 45-year-old man sat down in a press conference and said something that few had ever heard him say before. His name was Arne Slot. For over a year, the footballing world had celebrated this coach as a tactical genius, a direct descendant of the Dutch school who had taken the Premier League by storm. But behind the wins and the system was a secret that the manager himself never fully addressed. Something about the game, the philosophy, and the sacrifice it demanded. So, what exactly did Arne Slot finally admit? There is a certain kind of football mind that speaks through its system rather than what it says in interviews. Arne Slot was always that kind of person. Long before the world knew his name, before the touchline prowl and the stadiums erupting and the strategies that would outlive entire seasons, he was just a young man from the Netherlands, sitting in a dimly lit room, with a tactics board and a thought he couldn't quite articulate. Born in 1978, Slot grew up in a footballing household. But nothing about his early career suggested he was destined to become one of the most successful tactical innovators in modern history. What people who knew him back then remember most wasn't his technical brilliance. It was his quiet, the way he could sit in a locker room full of noise and still seem like he was somewhere else entirely, analyzing patterns that only he could see. He started as a player in the Dutch youth leagues. By the early 2000s, he had transitioned into coaching. The crowds were small. The energy was amateurish. But even then, according to people who worked with him during those years, Arne was different from the others. He didn't crave the adoration. He craved the control. There was always something he was reaching for tactically, a concept that felt just slightly beyond where the game was currently played. That quality, that quiet restlessness is what would eventually make him extraordinary. But it was also what made him hard to read. When Arne Slot took over as head coach of Feyenoord in 2021, something clicked. Not just tactically, but psychologically. Two elements of the game, defense and attack, finding a way to coexist that neither side of the ball could achieve alone. His early successes were promising. Then came the Eredivisie title. Then came the call from Anfield. But here is what most people missed about Arne Slot. Even as his reputation was rising, he processed everything, every emotion, every tactical setback, every private struggle, through his system, not through conversations, not through press conferences, through spacing and structure and positional play. According to people close to him during those early years, he almost never talked about how he was feeling. If something was wrong, you wouldn't hear it from him. You would see it in how he set his team up next. That pattern, creating a system as a way of holding something in rather than letting it out, would define the next phase of his career. And it raises a question that nobody asked loudly enough at the time. If Arne Slot was speaking through his tactics all along, what exactly was he saying? The answer, it turns out, was hiding in plain sight. And it would take a move to the most scrutinized league in the world to surface. Liverpool was not just a club. That sounds simple, but the reality of it was almost impossible to imagine. A manager arriving to replace a living legend, someone who had turned the club into a global force. On the surface, the story looked like a fairy tale. A tactical mind finding its perfect stage. But sources suggest that by the summer of 2024, the tension inside the dressing room had become something that couldn't be ignored. The weight of the legacy was complicated. The expectations were astronomical. And yet, every few days, Arne Slot would walk back into the training ground and coach systems about control, aggression, and positional play. Think about what that actually means. You are designing a system for a team that is comparing you to a titan while the players in front of you are struggling to adapt. You are training patterns about high pressing and you have to do it again and again until it looks right. That is not just professional pressure. That is something far heavier. Later press conferences revealed that games like Manchester City at Anfield, one of Slot's most high-profile fixtures, were approached during one of the most demanding periods the club had ever experienced. Slot has acknowledged that the tactical plan reflected his philosophy of control over chaos. But what did it feel like to impose that control? He never fully said. Not then. What the public saw was the performance, the aggressive pressing, the flawless positional play. What the public didn't see was what it cost. And here is what makes Slot's silence so striking during all of this. The sporting director spoke eventually. The players spoke. The recruitment team gave interviews over the years where they touched on the difficulty of that period. But Arne Slot, the man who designed the system that carried all of those tactics, stayed quiet, controlled, almost unreachable. Did you ever suspect that Liverpool's sudden tactical shift was more about the manager's internal struggle than the opposition's weakness? If you did, you were paying closer attention than most. Because what is coming next will make those suspicions feel very different. The system was a confession, but Arne Slot was the one person who never confessed. And the question of why would shape everything that came after. When the narrative around the squad shifted from the post-Klopp era to the Slot system, the football world received no grand explanation, no televised documentary, no statement that said this is the new identity. One day the team was playing transitional football, and then slowly, they weren't. For a club that has an identity as strong as Liverpool's, a system that demands discipline over emotion, the change was strange, unsatisfying. Journalists waited for clarity that never came. Tactical analysts asked questions that were deflected, and Arne Slot moved quietly into a different chapter of his life, one that involved evolving the system, tweaking the midfield structure, and a very deliberate distance from the narrative. According to reports from that period, Slot threw himself into new work almost immediately. He and his staff developed a new defensive shape, which debuted in the Premier League in September of that year. He coached, he refined, he stayed busy in a way that looked from the outside like tactical momentum. But people who were around him during those years have described something else underneath the productivity. A guardedness, a careful management of what he would and wouldn't talk about. Journalists from that season noted a pattern. Ask Arne about the system, and he would engage. Ask him about the future, and he would speak generally. Ask him about the personal pressure inside the job, about replacing a legend, about what really happened behind the scenes, and the conversation would shift politely, firmly. He was protecting something. The question that nobody could fully answer was, what? Some assumed it was simple professional caution for someone in an incredibly high-pressure job choosing to handle that privately. That is a reasonable explanation. But there is another possibility, one that Arne Slot himself would hint at much later. Perhaps the silence wasn't just about protection. Perhaps it was about not yet having the answers. Perhaps some tactical truths take decades to become speakable. If you have never heard this side of Slot's story before, you are not alone. Most people haven't. History remembered the season as a tactical triumph. It was quieter about the cost. That is exactly the kind of story this channel exists to uncover. So, if you are not subscribed yet, now is a good time because what comes next is where everything changes. The silence, it turned out, had a specific shape. And in 2024, Arne Slot finally let people see it. The press conference didn't look like a confession. That is important to understand. There was no dramatic setup, no emotional music playing in the background, no moment where Arne broke down or raised his voice. It was by all accounts a quiet conversation, the kind that only becomes significant once you understand the weight of what was being said. Arne Slot was 45 years old. He had lived through his rise in the Netherlands, his collapse at the top, and his extraordinary resurrection with Liverpool and the title charge. He had watched his system become part of the permanent fabric of English football culture. And somewhere in all of that, somewhere in the process of implementing those patterns, those seasons, those relationships, something had shifted inside him. According to those present for the conversation, he spoke with the calm of someone who had made a decision. Not an impulsive one, a considered one, the kind of decision that takes years to arrive at. What Slot confirmed was something fans had long felt but never had verified. That the psychological reality inside his system, the pain, the confusion, the struggle for control that was fracturing expectations, and the tactical philosophy that somehow survived it, had been present in his style all along. That the system was not just a commercial product shaped to fit the modern market. They were, in his own words, honest. More honest than he had ever publicly admitted them to be. He spoke about the difficulty of that period, about designing tactics while carrying things that had no easy outlet, about the way the training ground became for him a place where feelings that couldn't be spoken could at least be shaped into something. He acknowledged that the distance he kept from journalists, from tactical disclosure, from the narrative others were constructing around him, was deliberate. Not because he had something shameful to hide, but because he said, some things belong to the system and not to the explanation of it. But here is where it gets more complicated. Because what Slot confirmed wasn't just about the past. It was about how he had carried that past. For decades, he had presented a version of himself that was composed, professional, forward-looking, and that was real. But it wasn't complete. The part that was missing, the part he had quietly set aside for 30 years, was the acknowledgement that the system had cost him something. That creating it had required him to reach into places that were genuinely painful, and that he had done that consistently without ever telling anyone. Once he said it, something about the entire season shifted. Not the performances themselves, but the understanding of them. And the real shock wasn't the confirmation. It was the realization of how much had been sitting just beneath the surface all along, waiting to be named. Go back and watch his Liverpool side's approach to the derby. Really watch it, not just the scoreline, you already know the result. Watch the control in it. The way the aggression is enormous, but the execution is disciplined. The way it looks like a coach dictating the game from a careful distance. That distance was Arne Slot's signature, and once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Sources suggest that a number of Slot's most celebrated tactical plans were developed not in moments of creative inspiration, but in moments of genuine personal difficulty. Games of control, high-pressing patterns, carries a complexity that is difficult to fake. Even his defensive line, a structural choice that seems on the surface to be about pure footballing theory, was built on a fundamental system he constructed during a period of significant professional reflection. So why now? Why at 45 did Arne Slot finally choose to speak? That is the question that stays with you after everything else settles. He had years of opportunity. There were moments over the seasons, anniversaries, retrospectives, documentary projects where the door was open and he could have walked through it. He didn't. He kept the boundary in place politely, consistently. Something changed. And according to people close to him, the move to Liverpool was at the center of it.